Good morning, confirmands, and anybody else who's watching. Nice to have you with me this morning. As you can see, I'm in a new spot. The student ministry offices have actually moved. They moved while I was gone. We used to be up across from Festival Hall, and now we're in offices just off the student lobby. So we are back here. This is my new office. I'm still sort of moving in and getting things situated. But if you need any of us from student ministry, this is where we'll be from now on. And I kind of like it. I miss my window, but I'm in a good little spot here. Before we get started, I do want to say thank you to everybody who has been praying for me and reaching out to me and thinking about me and my family. I think I mentioned this last week, but my mom passed away a week ago Saturday. I'm grateful that my dad and my siblings and I were all there with her when she died. Still a little surreal to think that she's not here with us, but I really appreciate all your prayers and messages and texts telling me that you were thinking of me and praying for us. Those really have meant a lot. And I would ask that you can continue to pray for me and my family, especially my dad, who's really, really hurting a lot in these next few weeks. This will be really difficult for him. But thank you for being a family of faith and a family that supports those who are hurting. It really has meant a lot to me, and I will be eternally grateful for all of that. All right, let me share the screen so we can get on to the lesson today. Okay, all right, so it is the beginning of, before I do that, let's do announcements. This week, 412 is Glow Night. So it will be at 5:30. Come with all your best neon glow in the dark stuff. We're going to be doing all sorts of fun stuff, but wear whatever you can that glows in the dark, because that's going to be the theme for today. And then just a reminder that there is no confirmation and actually no student programming next week because it's Easter. So we want you guys to be able to spend Easter morning with your families. Some of you may be going out of town. Some of you may be having family in to celebrate Easter. So no confirmation, no Sunday school, no 412, nothing like that all next week because of Easter. And because it's Easter next week, that means today is Palm Sunday. So happy Palm Sunday. And the lesson we're going to talk about this week is I want to walk through with you Holy Week. What happens during that week leading up to Easter? There's so much that Jesus goes through. And I think sometimes there's a lot of not confusion, but there was so much that happened that I just want to kind of be able to lay it all out for you in the week so you can understand when Easter comes, why it's such a joyous and wonderful occasion. So we are going to start. So let me, some of the pictures I'm going to be showing are from my trip to when I went to Israel in 2016 with Scott Engel, but I want to actually set up the stage for you so you understand what's happening in Jerusalem and in Israel when Jesus is crucified. For about 40 years, the Romans have ruled over the Jews, meaning that the Romans came and they invaded and they took over. They are in control of the Jewish people that live in what we now know as Israel. And they were not kind to the Jews. They took advantage of them. They took over places that had been in families for years. Romans just kind of came in and said, thank you, we're the invaders, this is going to be ours. And the Jews were desperate to find a way to expel the Romans from their country and from Jerusalem especially. All they wanted to do was get the Romans out, but the Romans were so strong, they had such military might and political power that this was becoming very, very difficult to do. And so part of Jesus's popularity when he came on the scene was because he kept talking about being freed from bondage and having freedom, and all of these terms that a lot of the Jewish people took as being a political freedom. And they were looking at him as someone who was going to be able to come and defeat the Romans, get them out of Jerusalem, get them out of Israel, so they could go back and rule themselves and be in charge of their own country the way they had before the Romans came along. So many of the things that Jesus said, he was meaning them spiritually. I'm going to remove you from the bondage of sin. I am going to come and make you free so that you can be the person that God has called you to be without worrying about the sin in your life. But what people heard, because of the context in which they were living, was, oh, this guy's going to come and he's going to lead all of us to defeat the Romans and get them out of here so we can live peacefully together. And so when we come to Palm Sunday, this picture is actually taken from the Mount of Olives. All of those things in the foreground are actually tombs, Jewish tombs. That's basically a Jewish cemetery right there in the forefront. Jews believe that the closer you are to where the temple once stood, which is where that building is with the gold dome on it, that the quicker you will go to heaven when the Messiah comes or when God comes. So it's very sacred space there, and it's sort of high-end cemetery space right there too, because it's so close to where the temple used to be. But if you picture yourself standing here on the Mount of Olives, which is a hill, it's not a mountain, but it's a hill, and you think about what is behind you is a city that was called Bethpage. And Bethpage was where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. And if you remember the story about Mary and Martha, Jesus during his ministry went to their house, and Mary just wanted to sit and listen to Jesus, and Martha was busy, running around trying to be the nice hostess. And Martha complains about Mary, and Mary kind of complains about Martha, and Jesus says, you need to pay attention to me. And then their brother Lazarus is the person who died, and Jesus came after he had been put in the tube, and Jesus raised him back from the dead. He said, Lazarus, come out from the grave, and Lazarus did. So Lazarus and Mary and Martha have this very close relationship, friendship with Jesus. They are part of his people. And so when Passover came, which I will talk about in a minute, Jesus would go and stay with them. Remember, Jesus lived in the north. He lived in Nazareth. And so whenever he came to Jerusalem, usually he stayed with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, who lived just behind where this picture was taken. So every day when we talk about Holy Week and we talk about Jesus being in Jerusalem and doing this, every day he would walk into Jerusalem, do his business and do what he was doing, and then he would leave and walk back to Bethpage to stay the night with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And about a little bit halfway through, at the halfway up on the picture, you can see this stone fence or stone wall, actually, and that delineates the outside of the ancient city of Jerusalem. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So on Palm Sunday, remember, everybody thinks Jesus is here to free everybody from the Romans. So he comes into Jerusalem riding a donkey. And in the Old Testament, it talks about the conqueror will come riding in on a foal or on a donkey. And the people know this history. They know these verses from their Bible, the Old Testament. And so when they see Jesus come in on a donkey, they're more and more convinced that he is going to be the one who rids them of the Romans once and for all. All right, so I just want to get you guys to have an idea of how narrow the streets are. So this is actually in Old Town Jerusalem, and you can see the stalls of the merchants and things, but you can get an idea of how narrow these streets are. So when we talk about Palm Sunday, when people were waving their palms and cheering Jesus and putting their palms and their coats down as he walked in with on the donkey, we're not talking about a really wide street or a big boulevard type thing. These are very narrow streets. So the people would have been right up there next to Jesus. They probably could have reached out and touched him if they wanted to. So I just wanted to give you that idea that the sort of parade that Jesus had with Palm Sunday, everybody was in very, very tight quarters, and they were raising Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, because they were cheering on this idea that maybe Jesus was the one who was going to get rid of the Romans from their town once and for all. All right, so let's see, so here is a picture that I also took when I was in Israel, and this wall that you see is part of that wall that I pointed out before. And you can kind of see where the gates had been. They're closed up right now. Those were actually closed up during the Crusades in the 10th century. But in Jesus's day, those would have been gates to go in and out of the city. And so this is the eastern gate of Old Jerusalem. And this is where Jesus would have entered in with his donkey, on his donkey, and then walked through these narrow streets as people were cheering him on and excited, hopeful that this was the guy who was going to get rid of the Romans. And you have to remember that at this time, it's Passover. And Passover is the holiday that the Jews still celebrate today, which commemorates and remembers the time when the Jews had been slaves in Egypt, and Moses came and led them out of Egypt to make sure Pharaoh would let the Jews go out of Egypt. God sent 10 plagues over time, and the last plague was the plague of death. And what God told Moses to tell the Jewish people is that they needed to take a lamb, a perfect lamb, as perfect a lamb as they could find. They needed to slaughter the lamb and take the blood of that lamb and paint it on their doorpost. I know it sounds very weird and kind of cruel, but that's what they were told to do. And so any Jewish family who sacrificed a lamb and took its blood and painted it on their doorframe, when death came, God sent death over the land of Egypt. Anybody's whose house, their doorframe had blood on it from this lamb, death passed over. They weren't affected. And what happened is anybody who hadn't done that, mainly most of the Egyptians, their oldest, their firstborn son was killed or died. And it was that tremendous catastrophe that convinced Pharaoh that he needed to let the Jewish people go. And then that's when Moses led them out and they went through across the Red Sea into the wilderness. So that's what Passover is. It's this commemoration of when God was faithful to the Jews. If they sacrificed and did what God told them to do, he would protect them. And so every year, Jews go to Jerusalem to remember Passover, remember this incredibly important part of their heritage. And that's what they're all there for in Jerusalem. And for the most part, anybody who was able to go to Jerusalem, at least in Jesus's day, would go there. And so it would be packed with way more people than usually was there. And which is probably why Jesus had to stay with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, because there's no place to stay in the main city. So people would stay outside the city and come in for all the activities during the day and then head back out during the evenings. All right. So what happened? Palm Sunday, Jesus comes in, everybody's excited. Woo, here's the guy who's going to come and free us. This is what we really want. We're all excited about this. But then really nothing happens after that. So on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, all these different things happen. So this is actually a model of what the temple looks like or would have looked like in Jerusalem. That in the forefront, that wall is part of that wall that we still see today, the eastern wall of Jerusalem. Where those stairs are is where the gates were that we just saw in the last slide. And this was referred to as the temple complex. And so that building right in the middle of the picture was the temple, what it looked like in Jesus's day. Now we have to remember that Jesus was a rabbi, and so it would have been natural after Jesus had gotten to Jerusalem, after he had made this great entrance with people thinking he was going to overturn the Romans and send them away, that as a rabbi, he would go to the temple and he would teach, and he would hear other people teach, and people would be able to discuss with him. And so it was very normal on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of Holy Week that during those times, Jesus was going to the temple, talking to his disciples. But the thing that made it different for Jesus during this week, this particular week, is that when he went to the temple, he wasn't just teaching, or he wasn't worshiping or doing things like that. This is the time where he turned over all the money changers. So if you remember when I talked about sin a few weeks ago, in Jesus's day, to be forgiven of your sin, what would happen is that people would bring a sacrifice, depending on what they could afford. It could be a bird, a pigeon, a dove, up all the way up to a lamb or a bull or something, and that would be sacrificed on their behalf. And so when people came to Passover and they wanted to give their offering or their sacrifice in these big open spaces that you see in the temple complex, very smart, wise people who wanted to make money, entrepreneurs, I guess is the word for it, would set up their tables and they would have all their little animals there. And so people could come in and say, oh, I need a dove to be my sacrifice. And the money changer and one of the sellers there would say, oh, I have a lovely dove for you. And that they would charge them a crazy amount of money to take the dove to be the sacrifice. And so on one of the days, that first part of Holy Week, Jesus comes in and he sees all this commerce happening. He's seeing people making money off of the sacrifices by selling these animals. And he just is livid because no one should be making money off of the atonement of sins that is freely given from God. So he gets really angry and he turns over all the tables and he kind of freaks out and everybody gets all upset because he causes this big scene. But he is insulted that the temple has become this place of consumerism and people making money off of something that should be free. So that's one of the things that happens in the beginning of the week. One of the other things that he did at the temple was he started healing people. And the rabbis and the Jews who were in charge really took offense to this because they thought this may not make sense to us right now, but the temple was a holy site. And so to do healing meant that somebody who was sick or infirmed was in the temple complex and then they were healed. And to the rabbis, the higher up, the people, important rabbis of the day, that was not to be done. And so Jesus started really irritating them a lot too, because he was doing things that he wasn't supposed to do. He was upsetting the apple cart, so to speak. He was making things difficult. He was really pointing out people where their sin was and how they really weren't being faithful to what God had always called them to be. So those were kind of some of the things that he was doing on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. The other thing he was doing was he was with all his disciples and he knew his time was short. So he was spending all that time trying to cram in all the stuff he wanted them to know and remember and to learn, knowing that in a few days he wasn't going to be around. It's during these 3 days, the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of Holy Week, that the Jewish leaders also begin to plot to get rid of him because he's causing a scene in the temple, because he's starting to have a lot of power and a lot of followers, which was a threat to those rabbis, to the Pharisees, and to the Sadducees. That was their fancy name. They started plotting. They wanted to know, how can we get rid of this guy? He's starting to threaten our power. He's starting to upset sort of the regular way we do everything. And so they start plotting and trying to figure out how they can get rid of Jesus because he's becoming too much of a threat to their own power. It's also during these first 3 days of the week that Judas decides he's going to betray Jesus as well. Now, one little comment about Judas. Judas was one of those people who saw Jesus as the person who was going to throw out the Romans. And he really wanted this to happen. And so one of the reasons theologians speculate that Judas was willing to betray Jesus was he was trying to jumpstart this movement to get rid of the Romans. Some people think that Judas believed that if he could sort of push Jesus into doing something he didn't want to do yet, that he would start this revolution and people would rise up behind Jesus and get rid of the Romans. And obviously that's not what happened. Jesus's purpose wasn't to get rid of the Romans. Jesus' purpose was to die as a sacrifice, as a sacrificial lamb, the Passover lamb, the final Passover lamb that needed to be sacrificed for the forgiveness of our sins. All right. So then we get to Thursday, and traditionally Thursday of Holy Week is called Maundy Thursday. And Maundy is not a word we hear very often, except in reference to this day. And it comes from the Latin word meaning of mandatum. And mandatum means command. And the reason that Thursday of Holy Week is called Maundy Thursday is because it's the day of the Last Supper. And it's the last time that Jesus is with his disciples. And while he is with his disciples in that meal, he gives them his final command, the ultimate command, and that is to love one another. And that we find that out in John. A new command I give to you, love one another. And so it's that command to love, the one thing that Jesus wants his disciples to remember and all of us to remember, is that our ultimate charge from Jesus is to love God, to love Jesus, and to love others. And that's where the word Maundy comes from. But it is also the day of the Last Supper. So most of us, when we think of the Last Supper, might think of this painting. It's actually a fresco. It's up on a wall. It's by Leonardo da Vinci. And it is the Last Supper. And you have Jesus there in the middle, and then all of the other disciples next to him. This is not at all what the Last Supper would have looked like. They wouldn't have sat at a table that was long and skinny with everybody on one side. I mean, when you think about it, it's like, what a weird dinner that would be, everybody looking out at nobody. More likely what the Last Supper would have looked like is something like this. They would have been in a very small room. It would have been lit by oil lamps. There's Jesus over there on the left, and everybody would have been reclining or sitting on the floor on cushions. The table would have been very low. They would have been sort of reclining on one another a little bit. It would have been a very intimate time. And the reason they all came together was to celebrate the Passover Seder, which is the meal that Jews remember Moses is leading the Jewish people out of Egypt. So that was the occasion. But it was at the Last Supper that Jesus did very intimate things. It's when he washed his disciples' feet, including Judas's feet. It's when he gave the Last Supper, and he, talked about breaking the bread and drinking from the cup and all of these things. Once again, he's trying so desperately to get all of this last information in before it's time for him to go to the cross, which he knows is coming soon. All right. While the Last Supper is happening, Judas is actually sitting right next to Jesus. And at one point, Jesus says to him, go do what you have to do. Jesus knows what Judas has been up to. And he then declares to all the disciples, one of you is going to betray me tonight. And they're all like, what? Not me. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. But after Jesus says that, Judas gets up and leaves, and he goes to the Pharisees and gets paid his 30 coins of silver and tells them where Jesus is and where he's going to go. Right after the dinner, he's going to go to the garden. And that sets up the time for Jesus to be arrested. So it's interesting to think about how Judas felt about all of this and how Jesus felt, but Jesus loved Judas all the way to the end. And he did that by putting him at his right hand at the Last Supper, which was the place of honor. All right. So after the Last Supper, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And this picture is actually taken from where the Garden of Gethsemane is. And as you look up, those are those same eastern gates I talked about a little while ago. And remember, they wouldn't have been cemented up. There would have been actual gates there. And Jesus goes there with Peter, James, and John. And he tells them, come with me. I'm going to pray. I need you to pray with me. Poor Peter, James, and John keep falling asleep. It's late. They've just had this great meal. They're sleepy. But while they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is praying out to God, and he says, please take this cup from me. And what he's asking God to do is take away his need to be sacrificed on the cross. He knows what's coming. He knows it's going to be unpleasant. He knows it's going to hurt, but he asks God to please don't make me do this. But finally, he says, but your will be done. And he submits to what God has asked him to do, even though he knows it's not going to be pleasant and it's going to be hard. And the other thing I think we have to remember, which was pointed out when we were in the Garden of Gethsemane, is that Jesus would have been able to look up at those gates and see the Roman soldiers come down with their torches coming to get him. And he easily could have seen those torches coming, turned and run a few miles in the other direction out into the wilderness, and they would have never found him. It would have been very, very easy for Jesus to escape at that point. But he stays because he has told God, not my will, not what I want, but I'm going to do what you want. and you want me to stay here and be arrested. And so that's what he did. And so the Roman soldiers come down. Judas leads them to the garden. He knows exactly where Jesus is going to be praying, and he betrays him with a kiss. In some movies, it's a kiss on the cheek, but what I learned in Israel is that it would have most likely been a kiss on the hand. That would have been the respectful way for people to approach a rabbi, which is what Jesus was. So most likely Judas went and kissed Jesus's hand, which was the signal to the Roman soldiers, this is Jesus, this is the one that you want. And from then Jesus is arrested and taken to be put on trial. All right, the next day, we have Maundy, Thursday, and then we have Good Friday. And you might wonder, why do we call it Good Friday? That's such a weird thing, because that's the day that Jesus is crucified. But good comes from the Old English word gwad. I think that's how you say it, but that means holy. So really all we're saying is that it's Holy Friday. And when you think about that, it is a Holy Friday because it's when Jesus sacrifices himself on our behalf. So after Jesus is arrested, he actually spends a lot of time being bounced between the Roman people in charge and the Jewish people in charge. Each of them, it's way too complicated to get into there, but he kind of ping pongs around, everybody trying not to arrest him or condemn him to death. But then finally, the Jews tell Pontius Pilate, who's the head Roman in Jerusalem, this guy's a king, he's threatening your power, you need to get rid of him. And finally, Pontius Pilate says, okay, I will do it. When that happens, Judas realizes that instead of this uprising happening, that everybody's going to get behind Jesus and he's going to lead the Romans out, as soon as Jesus is condemned to death, Judas realizes what a terrible mistake he's made. He realizes that what he thought was going to happen wasn't going to happen. And now Jesus was going to be killed pretty much for what he did. And so he returns the 30 pieces of silver to the Pharisees that had paid him because he feels so guilty. And he goes out to the Hymnan Valley and he hangs himself. And so this is a picture of the Hymnan Valley. And I wanted to show it to you because Jerusalem is this large, bustling metropolitan city. In parts of it outside of Old Jerusalem, there are high rises. You know, it's bigger than Dallas. It's not quite New York, but has that sort of same feel to it. But right in the middle of the city, just outside Old Jerusalem, there is this valley, the Hymnan Valley, and there's nothing there. Nothing has been built on it. Nothing has been done to it. And the reason for that is in Jesus's day, this was pretty much the town garbage dump. And so this is where everything that was dumped that was unclean. And to the Jews, anything that was unclean, they were not supposed to touch or, have anything to do with. And Judas goes and kills himself there. He hangs himself. And that is dead bodies are unclean also. So up until even today, this valley is considered cursed and is considered a place that is unclean and not a place where anybody wants to build anything, which I think is fascinating. Even 2,000 years later, it is this sort of wasteland in the middle of the city because of what happened 2,000 years ago. All right, so as Jesus is being sort of tossed between the Romans and the Pharisees, he gets to Pilate and Pilate orders him to be flogged. And what flogging meant is that they would strip him of his clothes and they would tie his arms around a tree stump or a stone or a rock, and then they would flog him. And this is what they would have flogged him with. If you can see, it was a leather whip, and on all of those knots are very sharp, almost like barbed wire. And so they would whip the back of the person. And the whole point of it was for those barbed wire pieces to grab the flesh and to grab the muscle and pull at it and pull it off. So a lot of times when people were flogged before they were crucified, the flogging itself would kill them because of all of the blood loss, of all of the shock of having all of this pain and their skin and their muscle being torn off their backs. But that's what Jesus went through, but he didn't die while he was flogged. He continued to live. And then they told him, you have to carry your cross out to where you're going to be crucified. Now, in all the movies and pictures that we see Jesus carrying the actual cross. But most likely what would happen is that he just carried the cross beam. The vertical beam of the cross probably was permanently fixed into the ground. And so that the criminal, whoever was going to die on the cross, was just expected to carry the cross beam of the cross. And here is a drawing. Modern day archaeologists believe that crucifixion was actually done more like that. Most of us think of Jesus obviously having his hands out, but his feet kind of come together and one nail going through both his feet. But archaeologists have learned from excavations and such that most likely Jesus's feet were on either side of the vertical part of the cross, and the nails went through his ankles. And then most likely the nails went through his wrists as opposed to his hands. But that this is an example of someone being crucified. The other thing that I think most people don't realize is Jesus would have been only a few feet off the ground. It wasn't like the cross was super high and everybody was looking up at him. He would have been almost at eye level. That the vertical beam of the cross would have been set so that you could almost be at eye level with the criminal. And that was on purpose. The Romans wanted people to see the torture and the how awful being crucified was, the pain and just the unbearableness of it, because they wanted to encourage people not to do things that would lead to their crucifixion. So it was sort of like, you do something bad, this is what's going to happen. And they wanted everybody to be able to see it clearly. So this is, again, that same model that I showed before, and you can see that opening a little bit in the center of the picture. If you come out and you see all those rocks to the left, that was a quarry, and that actually was where Jesus was crucified. He had to be crucified outside of the walls of the city, because after people were crucified, they were dead and they were unclean, so they couldn't be made unclean inside the city. And as you can see, there's a path. If you go from that opening out, there's a walkway or a path, and then there's another one that crosses across the photo. And so they wanted to make sure that they would crucify people in a very busy intersection of the city, so a lot of people could see what was going on. The Romans were incredibly cruel. They were incredibly good at doing this because they had done it so much, but they really wanted to set an example for people, and they wanted to see up close. They wanted people to see up close what would happen to them if they disobeyed what the Romans told them to do. So this is what we refer to the area called Golgotha, or the place of the skull. Like I said, it would have been outside the city. The cross would have been no more than 3 feet off the ground. So you would have been able to see Jesus very, very close to you. And that was all purposeful on the part of the Romans. So what happens is Jesus goes up on the cross all night. He's been going back and forth between the Romans and the Jews, and they finally decide to flog him and to crucify him. He goes up on the cross at 9 a.m. in the morning, and at 3 o'clock, he hangs on the cross for 6 hours. And at 3 o'clock, he finally dies. Now, one thing I do want to make sure you understand is that he didn't die the way we think of humans dying. The Bible is very specific and says he gave up his spirit. And that's important to note because we have to remember that Jesus was fully God as well as fully human. So as being fully God, he can't die, but he gave up his spirit, meaning he purposefully decided to stop living and return to the Father, because that's what God had asked him to do. So he didn't die. I mean, physically, his body died, but it wasn't as if they killed him. He gave himself up. He did that for us. It was a deliberate decision on his part to give up his spirit. So I think that's something important that we need to remember. All right, so this actually is a picture of the rock in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It is the rock that they believe the that Jesus was crucified on, that the cross would have been in that little center hole. There is a whole church that has been built around this, an Eastern Orthodox church. So when you walk in, there are all these incense and oils and very elaborate and ornate place. But it is believed that this is actually the rock where Jesus was crucified. All right, so what happens? Jesus dies, they take him off the cross. It is almost the beginning of Passover, so they have to hurry up and bury him. Joseph of Arimathea, who was a very wealthy man, and who was a secret follower of Jesus, who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, asked to take his body, and he places him in a grave that no one had ever laid in before. And that might sound like, well, of course, who reuses graves? But in Jesus's day, that's exactly what would happen. So this is a picture of a grave from the time of Jesus, not Jesus's grave, but this is what it would have looked like. People would have put the bodies in these little chambers or these little carved out caves out of rocks. They would have put a rock or something big in front of it, because as the body decays, it starts to smell and it attracts animals, and they didn't want anything to disturb the body. After a very, very long period of time, the body would decay and all that would be left would be bones. They would take the bones and put them in another smaller stone box that was called an ossuary. And then they would take those bones and bury them or do something with them. And then they could use the grave again. So it was not uncommon for graves to be used over and over again after the bodies had decayed. But in the Old Testament, it's prophesied that the Messiah would be put in a grave that had never been used before. And Joseph of Arimathea fulfilled that prophecy. He had a grave that nobody had ever died in before, or been laid in before after they died. And that's where they put Jesus, and they rolled the stone away. As you guys know, that the Jewish leaders had remembered that Jesus had said he was going to come back to life after 3 days. So they not only put the big stone in front of his tomb, they sealed it, they put guards there. They wanted everything possible so that he couldn't escape if some way they had tricked people and that he would be able to get out. And then on Easter morning, on Sunday morning, 3 days later, they count Friday as a day, Saturday, and then Sunday. So 3 days. Mary Magdalene is going to the tomb. She wants to, it's just after Passover has ended. She wants to go and anoint Jesus's body and clean it and do all the things that they didn't have time to do on Friday. And when she gets there, she meets these angels who say he's not here. The stone has been rolled away. The grave is empty. Where all the cloths were that had been wrapped around him were neatly folded, where his body has lain. And that's when Mary turns around and she sees somebody. She thinks he's the gardener and says, what have you done with his body? And Jesus says to Mary, he speaks her name. He says, Mary. And she realizes that it's the resurrected Jesus, that he did exactly what he said he would do. All right, one last thing I want to leave with you. When Jesus is back at the Last Supper, the last thing he does is he prays, and he prays for his disciples. He prays for what's going to happen, but he also prays for all the future believers. He prays for those who will come after his disciples, who will believe in him. And I just want to leave you with the thought that Jesus prayed for you. One of the last things he did was he prayed for you as a future believer. He prayed for me. He prayed for the world of believers that would come after him. And I find that to be really personal and really touching, that even when he knew what was ahead of him, he was praying for those who would be followers of him into eternity, because he cared for us that much, or he cares for us that much. All right, here are some discussion questions for you. You can just pause the video and read them. There is some scripture. I would really encourage you to read the scripture. Next week, when you celebrate Sunday, we get to celebrate all the wonderful, great things that happened on Easter, his resurrection, and what that means for us. I also do want to encourage you guys to go to the Maundy Thursday service and the Good Friday service if you are able. I will say they are very moving services. If you've never been to them before, remember, confirmation is a year where we try things that we've never tried before just to see if we like them. the Monday, Thursday service is wonderful. The Good Friday service is usually my most favorite service of the whole year, even better than Easter, because it really comes home to me every year what Jesus did just for me, and that was to die on the cross. So I hope you guys have a great week. Remember, no class next week, no 412 next week, and we will see you back here on the 24th. Happy Easter, everybody.